have guests from outside the university, and I welcome you all. My name is Niva Elkin-Koren. I'm a law professor here at the Faculty of Law, and I'm the director of the Haifa Center for Law and Technology. It's a great pleasure to welcome all of you, family members and friends, students, and our guests from abroad. It's also I think, the beginning of the semester, so welcome back, students and faculty, to the spring semester. It doesn't look like spring outside, but I think that in Israel we can be optimistic that spring will come very soon. This is a very special evening that we have today in honor of the new book by Dr. Elder Haber. Here is a book, Criminal Copyright. Criminal Copyright was published by Cambridge University Press in the summer of 2018, just last summer. And this event is actually part of a great tradition that we have in the Faculty of Law of honoring new books. A book is always an admirable academic achievement. Congratulations. It often takes long hours to write and shape, and it's always exciting when we have this opportunity to focus on a particular issue and bring together these thoughts to a successful conclusion in a book, a product, and especially when such book is published by this distinguished publication, Cambridge University Press. But this book event for Dr. Elder Haber is even more exciting for us tonight because of the author of the book. And it feels like a family event. And this is not just because of the family, their personal family. Where are the kids? That is here. But also because Elder is family. Dr. Elder Haber is a graduate student of Haifa University. He graduated with an LLB in law, a BA in psychology, an LLM in law and technology, and all in 4 years. He was also the legendary coordinator of the Haifa Center for Law and Technology for many years. And of course, after completing his PhD in Tel Aviv University with Professor Michael Biernack, another former member of this faculty, he went to the Berkman Center at Harvard University for a postdoc, and we were very delighted and fortunate that he chose to come back to our faculty at the conclusion of his postdoc as a senior lecturer. The publication of the book is therefore sort of coming a full circle, not just for you, but for all of us, I think. And I bet that some of us feel that we have a bite in this product, definitely your supervisor. What I'd like to do this evening, we're going to have a few speakers that will talk about the book and about the academic achievements in the book. This is knowing Dr. Elder Haber, you probably, when you know him personally, you know that once he finished one achievement, this was like summer of 2018, and he's already, running into the next challenges, and therefore it was really important for us to actually take a pause and spend some time on the book, and that is what we're going to try to do tonight with the help of our distinguished speakers. But before we start that, I'd like to ask our dean, Professor Oren Gazai-Rayal, to say a few words of greetings.
Thank you so much, Niva. It's really great pleasure and much pride to open this inaugurating event for Eldar Haber's book on criminal copyright. Eldar is a walking success story. A graduate of this law school, who also graduated, as Niva said, the Department of Psychology, completed his master and PhD in a record time of, together, I think, 3 years. Wrote numerous articles while writing his PhD dissertation. Don't ask me how can anyone do that. And at the end of the process, was one of the only 3 scholars ever to join this faculty directly at the rank of senior lecturer, and actually the youngest one among the 3. This book is about copyright, something I know nothing about, but it's also about criminalization, something I at least pretend to know something about. And I'm proud to learn that Eldar, like many other members of this law school, does not settle for criticizing the trends of over-criminalization of copyright law, but also go to the policymakers in Jerusalem, and that's very tiring, and make sure, or do his best to make sure it's not easy, that they will change the policies and assure better policies and reduce over-criminalization in Israel. With the background that he has as an internationally renowned scholar as he is, I'm sure they take his opinion seriously. So Eldar, congratulations for this really wonderful achievement, though for you it's just one of those many achievements you can count on the belt. I would also like to thank 2 other people who are going to be also speakers today. To Niva, a member of this faculty, and to Michael, though he's a member of some faculty in the south of Israel. He used to be a member of this faculty, so don't count it against him. Who took care of Eldar, guided Eldar through the years. I'm sure both of you have a lot to do with this success. Though most of the credit still goes to Eldar, I'm sure you had much to do with that. I would also like to thank Professor Peter Yu for taking the time and participating in this event. And last but not least, thank all the organizers of this event, of course, Yoni and Tad and everyone else, and above all, the mythological organizers of all the event, Lily Feigl-Shore, for bringing us all here today. Thank you so much, and apologies that I won't be able to stay so much because of family issues. Let's go like that. Thanks.
Thank you, Oren. Family is definitely the theme of this evening. But I want to talk about someone who is not a family member. His name is Aaron Schwartz. And he was an American computer scientist, and he was an American activist and a hacktivist that is hacking as part of activism. He was one of the organizing activists behind Creative Commons, an organization that is actually on a mission to make educational materials and other materials, creative materials, accessible to the general public. By the way, our own clinic here of Law and Technology is representing Creative Commons in Israel and is doing this work for the Hebrew licensing and enabling of access. But let's go back to Aaron Schwartz. In 2011, he was a research fellow at Harvard University, and he connected his computer to the MIT network through an unlocked closet at the MIT campus, and systematically downloaded hundreds and thousands of scientific articles from a system that is called JSTOR. He was arrested and charged by federal prosecutors in the United States. Aaron Schwartz declined a plea bargain that offered him to serve 6 months in federal prison. And 2 weeks later, he committed suicide. And when you come to think about it, this is copyright liability that we normally think about. I mean, we law professors, but I'm sure that our colleagues in other departments are thrilled when our students are actually reading the papers and noticing them. I just heard, I was on another conference of the Ministry of Justice this morning, where they brought some data on the fact that people spend on articles 37 seconds, which means that even if they come across an article, they don't even read it. But we would think that access to scientific articles would be something that should be promoted, and that would normally be true for many of the creative content that we think about. And copyright law, for good reasons, also protect the exclusive rights of owners to prevent others from using their works for the purpose of remuneration and creating incentives for these authors. But beyond the civil right to bring a lawsuit against Aaron Schwartz in that case, that would probably have produced, would have produced nothing for the owners, because the value or the damages that you can get for this might have been minimal. The question is, why? Why bring criminal charges in situations of that sort? Why take a civil right to bring a lawsuit and turn it into criminalize it and allow prosecutions to act upon a behavior of that sort? And this question, why criminalize copyright infringement, is actually at the heart of this new book. And this book, surprisingly, is one of the very few studies worldwide to address these questions that is actually so important and actually was critical for, in the context of Aaron Schwartz, but is also important and affect our behavior as law-abiding citizens that may risk a civil lawsuit but would never want to be involved in criminal charges. The book is one of the few studies, but it's definitely offers the most rigorous and comprehensive analysis of criminal copyright. It goes back to the history of criminalizing copyright and seek to address some of the challenges that criminalizing copyright is actually creating nowadays. We will hear more about these challenges from our three speakers tonight, and I'd like to start with our distinguished speaker from abroad, Professor Peter Yu. Professor Yu is a professor of law and director of the Center of Law and Intellectual Property at Texas A&M University. He's a leading global expert in international IP and international trade. Born and raised in Hong Kong, Professor Yu was among the first legal experts to study the transition of the legal system in China and Hong Kong, and he was kind enough to join us yesterday for a fascinating event of the Haifa Center for Law and Technology in collaboration with Gabrielli and Zaligson law firms, where we awarded fellowships. One of the students that received the fellowship is here. And we also addressed the question of China's transition from a country that is focusing on counterfeits into a country that is heavily engaged in innovation. Thank you for yesterday too. Professor Yu is a prolific scholar. He authored and edited 7 books and more than 150 law review articles and book chapters. His publications have appeared in Chinese, in English, and has been translated to Arabic, French, Japanese, Portuguese, Spanish, Vietnamese. Hebrew is not included. We need to fix that. Professor Yu is also a dear friend of the faculty. He was here teaching, how long ago was it?
2012.
All right, so, and hopefully you'll be back to our global program. It's a great honor to have you here tonight. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Nifa, for such a kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be back here. This is the second time I'm in Haifa, and so it's wonderful. But it's even more delightful to be able to join you guys in celebrating Eldar's wonderful book. It's just an honor to be here. So what I'm going to do is to pick up on what Nifa started with the story of Aaron Schwartz, but put you in the context of why this book is so important. And that's actually the criminal copyright movement. That is a very key part of the book. And if you get the quote right here, the criminal copyright movement must be stopped or at least substantially slowed. That's in the final chapter of the book, right? So that you can see why it's important. So what I'm going to do is to provide a context before I get into the book. And so I started off with international developments, in part because that is also in the first chapter of the book. And so TRIPS agreement is the International Intellectual Property Agreement of the World Trade Organization. And it covers a lot of different provisions. There are over 70 provisions within the TRIPS agreement. And these are the enforcement provisions, but only one of them is actually about criminal enforcement. That shows you how a lot of countries do not see criminal enforcement an issue that should be legislated at the international level. But that is slowly changing when a lot of countries trying to push other countries to offer stronger protection of intellectual property through the criminal law system. And that's why there have been a lot of negotiation of international agreements. So free trade agreements is a very good example. The latest one is actually about a decade ago between the United States and South Korea, and that includes a lot of provisions with respect to criminal enforcement. The anti-counterfeiting trade agreement, which is an important part of the book, is also very active in pushing for criminal enforcement, and I especially find it interesting to talk about ACTA in part because that's how I met Elder when we were talking about the issues and finding why it's so problematic to have a lot of criminal enforcement provisions. And after ACTA, we also have the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. As you can see right here, there's a coffin right there because it was not very successful after the United States withdrew from the negotiations. After signing the agreement, withdrew from the entire treaty. But the reason why I want to mention this one is that there has been a lot of development even after the US have withdrawn from the TPP agreement. The remaining parties continue and they cap the criminal enforcement provisions right there. And so that's a CPTPP, and that was included afterwards. And a lot of those provisions are in response to the WTO case about whether we should have more protection through the criminal law system. And so this is the provision within TRIPS agreement. So this provision focuses only on counterfeiting and piracy and is on a commercial scale. The problem though is that those are not well defined, and it's very difficult for a lot of countries to figure out what they're going to include as part of the local legislation. So what they try to do in a lot of agreements is to make them broader to cover all the direct, indirect, economic or commercial advantage, so that you don't need to define what is a commercial scale, what is covered, and what is not. So that they can broaden the use of the criminal enforcement system. And the idea is that if you focus on criminal laws, then you will serve the deterrent effect people will be very concerned about taking action by stealing intellectual property. And even for other agreements like the Regional Comprehensive Partnership Agreement that is not involving the major developed countries, and with China and India heavily participating, they still include criminal enforcement provisions. And one big provision is about preventing camcording in cinema. They're very concerned about piracy, where people just go into a cinema and using a camcorder to capture the movie and then sell it as a DVD or put it on a streaming platform. But it's not only just at the international level, it's also a lot of development at the US level or at the national level. So Aaron Schwartz is a very good example. But if we are going to go back, it has to start with this guy, David Lamacchia, who actually also is at MIT, and so it's basically in that area when Aaron Schwartz was right there. And he has this idea of providing a platform to allow people to share the software, and that becomes very problematic for the software industry because he's allowing people to actually have access to the software without paying for it. The problem, though, is at that time, you cannot go after somebody who is not making any profit when you are distributing the software on the internet. And so they need to respond by coming up with a new statute that says that it does not matter whether you put this on the internet for profit or whether you're just helping others who might need access. And that's why we have the whole discussion. And the reason why I brought this up is also because it's a key part of the book. And so it's a very important issue, and that has started in part because there are a lot of various groups that post a lot of the software, both at the underground level as well as on the internet for other people to download. And what the US has done is started with the legislation and then trying to impose the legislation onto other countries through international agreements. So that's what we usually describe as legal transplant. You transplant the provisions to other places. And what I want to do is to share with you the latest transplant that's actually not included in Elder's book because it's negotiated after the book has been published, and that's the USMCA. That's the new version of the NAFTA, and that's between United States, Mexico, and Canada. So those are the four things that I've highlighted. One is to provide criminal procedures and penalties to not only activities with commercial advantage and financial gain, which I mentioned earlier on, but also a substantial prejudicial impact on the interests of copyright holders. This is as broad as you can get. What do you mean by substantial prejudicial interest? It's entirely up to you to interpret. Second one is the protection against camcording. I think that's increasingly common in international agreements. And third one is the extension of criminal liability to aiding and abetting. It's not only just you have infringed at the criminal level, but you're also helping other people to do that. At one point, the Anti-Counterfeit Trade Agreement actually mentioned inciting as well. And then the last one is requirement of criminal enforcement to new areas, such as trade secret and circumvention or technological protection measure. Right? So this will give you ideas of how expansive the provisions are at the criminal enforcement level. So what you can see right here is basically we are increasing the level, and the USMCA is the latest one. That is what we consider as the high watermark in terms of criminal enforcement as well as other standards. But what we are doing here is actually not talk about all these developments of international agreements or the latest legislation. What we are going to do here is actually celebrate his book. So what I'm going to share with you is the 5 things that are very impressive with respect to the book. And I think I'm not going to spoil all the details about the book, but I think this will actually capture what's going on right there. So the first one is that I find it very comprehensive in terms of how we approach the issues. And I pose a picture of here with the dualities to show this is a very interesting way for us to think about a lot of those issues. So what he has done in the book is to talk about the different binaries that are out there: public versus private, criminal versus copyright, international versus domestic, the past versus the present, so that all of us can actually do our own comparison. If we are focused on the wrong at the criminal level, then it's usually the harm is done to society. But if the wrong is done to the copyright holder, that the harm to the society may not necessarily be the same, and that requires to actually think about whether we need to do more cost-benefit balancing in terms of how we're going to structure the system. Because sometimes we want to protect the intellectual property holder. At other times, we might feel that, well, we need to balance the interests of society so that we don't overprotect to the expense of the members of the society. The second thing I think is actually quite impressive is the methodology that's been used. The book is very methodical, and I'm going to share with you actually the table of contents. And so I can see a proud supervisor here just looking at what has been done. So if you look at what he has done right here, I think this is one of the best example of how to do a very systematic analysis of issues that are highly complex, they involve different type of system. So he started off providing overview with all the binaries I mentioned earlier on, and then go into specific cases in the UK as well as in the US, and then identify the legal problem, which is the criminal copyright gap, and then go into both the internal reasoning and the external reasoning, and then try to synthesize both of them together to offer you a new approach and provide some very practical recommendations on how to go forward, and end with some suggestions about the future. Right? That's basically a very quick 1-minute synopsis of the whole book. But I think that is actually done in a brilliant way, in a way that a lot of the readers can follow from one chapter to another, and in a very systematic analysis. The third thing I like about the book is that it's very globally oriented. And for me, who has done a lot of work on international IP, this is actually highly welcoming, because we want to have a book that will inform us about the latest development with specific case studies, but we also want it to tie to the larger debate. And I think this book is very successful. And ACTA is a very good example. A lot of people are very concerned about the criminal enforcement issues. Some of the kids are actually very passionate about what's going on there. But the biggest issue is that what happens at the international level will also have ramifications at the domestic level. And that's why it's something we actually need to care about. And this is basically a slide with all different legislatures showing that they have been actively reforming the copyright system in light of a lot of the international obligations. The fourth one is basically when you have two systems that are coming up and fighting with each other, and that is increasingly happening in the intellectual property field. So one important question that he asked, and I love this picture in part because one, I got a very an anime that I like quite a bit, and the other is that you can actually see the impact. So you have the fight between the copyright system as well as the criminal system. The question is here, why would the copyright system prevail, right? And that is important for a lot of reasons. If you are a criminal law scholar, then you want to know why the copyright system can actually push the criminal law system out. But if you're a copyright scholar, you also want to know whether we're actually misusing the system in a way that is not beneficial to society. And I think this is increasingly important because we have the copyright system keeps on expanding and covering all different areas. We intentionally will have this battle between copyright and criminal law, copyright and free speech, copyright and public health, and we need to analyze the issues similarly to what we have done in this book. And the last one I want to end on is also that, well, he's very practical in terms of how we're going to, as the dean mentioned early on, he has been working very hard, or at least trying to work with the policymakers and legislators in trying to come up with good proposals. And what he has done in the book is there are 4 different things we need to look at. We need to examine whether copyright infringement is either harmful or wrongful or both. Number 2, examine whether the state or society has a substantial interest in the statute's objective. Number 3, examine whether the criminal law will directly advance the substantial state interest and whether it's more efficient than other measures, for example, civil or administrative law. And the last evaluation is examine the consequences of criminalization by conducting a cost-benefit analysis. right? So those are the things that people can actually follow and try to do examination. And I think these type of things, when you can nail down into 4 things that policymakers can look at, is always quite effective because they know exactly where to go forward. Now, for this type of event, there's nothing complete without roasting him. So what I'm going to do is to end with 3 different questions that I think will be quite relevant to the book. It's somewhere in there, but at the same time, I want to push him a little bit on that. So the first one is obviously about the copyright holders and the copyright industries, and usually represented by our beloved Mickey Mouse right here. And with respect to 4 stages of evaluation, a lot of those analysis is very subjective. And for example, number 2, whether the state has a substantial interest in a statute's objective, if you ask the copyright industries, the answer will be totally different if you ask, for example, Electronic Frontier Foundation. Right? So I think that is going to be quite complicated, even if policymakers are following exactly what we propose. Right? The analysis can still come out in a totally different way. So that's number 1. Number 2 is about efficiency, which is also mentioned in one of your stage of evaluation. It has to be more efficient than other measures. So this clearly shows that you believe that the criminal system should be used as a last resort, right? So you can only go for it if it's more efficient. But the question is, why can we not go for it if it's as efficient, right? You don't necessarily need to go for more efficient. And there's also a question about how do we measure efficiency? Is it Pareto efficiency or is it Calder-Hicks efficiency? If they're claiming that, well, all the public is no worse off, but we are better off, would that be sufficient? Or do you actually need the public to be better off in order to go for criminal enforcement? And the last one I will end on is actually how you started with the book. The book is started with a lot of issues about the criminal copyright enforcement, criminal copyright movement at the international level. But the suggestions you offer is very national oriented, right? So how would we actually be able to use some of the ideas if the development is not from the national legislature, but actually at the high level where they have the treaties imposed on them, right? So those are the very interesting questions that we can explore. But before I stop here, I just want to offer another congratulations to Elder for an excellent book. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Fascinating. I guess Elder will have an opportunity to answer these questions. I think your remarks reminded me that this book should have been a must for our policymakers, because unfortunately, our legislator that failed to amend other laws, including the election law in Israel just before the election, managed to amend copyright law and criminalize some activities that are ordinary, like linking to infringing materials. Our next speaker is Professor Michael Birnhak. We said family the theme, so Michael is also family. Michael is a law professor at Tel Aviv University Faculty of Law and Associate Dean for Research. He's also the director of the Horowitz Institute for Intellectual Property and the director of the Parasol Foundation International LLM. Professor Birnhak studied intellectual property law, information law, and law and technology. And among his many roles, he also served at some important committees, such as the Israeli Public Council for Protection of Privacy, the European Commission on the Israeli Data Protection, and the Shufman Committee on Data Protection. I wish they would have adopted all of your recommendations in these roles. Please.
Hello, good evening, Shalom. Dear Eldar and Hadar and Muli and Nevu ran away. So Avi and Aviva as well, and dear friends It's exciting. It's a great pleasure to be here tonight. The publication of a book is a cause for celebration of the individual author's achievement, but also for the joy of learning and the joy of knowledge, and for us, the readers of such a book. So, as has been mentioned, I've had the pleasure of supervising Eldar's work, also known as Doc 3. Every fall, I gather all my PhD students, so Eldar is Doc 3. And it was a pleasure to supervise Eldar. As my colleagues from the academia in this room know, supervision of PhDs and other advanced degrees is a delicate task. It's not always easy, it's complex, there's a relationship there that is going on. And the goal or the purpose or the challenge is to navigate, for the supervisor, is to navigate and find the way between showing or trying to show the way, but not walking instead of the supervised student. That is taken from my mother-in-law. In Eldar's case, it was easy. Eldar pulled me. I didn't have to push him in any direction. If anything, I had to, okay, hold, take it easier, slow down a bit, and let's, settle in. I had to catch up with him rather than me pulling him. And I learned a lot. I learned a lot about criminal copyright, and I learned a lot about Eldar, I think. This book is a wonderful achievement, of course, but it's Eldar's. That introduction was for me to be able to say that it's Eldar's wonderful achievement. It is rich in content and insights. Eldar did not leave one stone unturned. This book offers a comprehensive discussion of criminal copyright, and it exemplifies Eldar's legal and research skills. You have here a study of legal history, of empirical analysis of the law, legal analysis that is not limited to one field, a normative theoretical analysis, and the ability for sound policy recommendations, which Peter has summarized previously. Eldar tells the story of criminal copyright, but it is more than this. The conflicts, challenges, and dynamics of the law in this topic exemplify the broader issues about copyright. These are conflicts between promoting the progress of science and the control given to the owners, the copyright owners, content industries in many cases. These are conflicts between property and speech, challenges of new technologies, and a lot of politics, which is what I will be focusing on in the remainder of my comments. In fact, Eldar's book is not only a work on or in the field of IP, it's a work in law and society in this sense. So before I delve into the arguments and a few thoughts, let's begin with a story. So it's not Aaron Schwartz, I'm going back 100 years earlier. Let's go back to the 1920s, to this place, Palestine, then under the British Mandate. It had in place criminal copyright law, and in fact, not only one law, but actually two pieces of legislation. One was the Imperial Copyright Act of 1911, which was spread in other dominions, colonies, mandates, etc., which the Imperial Act defined the subject matter of copyright, the scope of protection, etc. The Act had a section 11, about criminal copyright, with a punishment that included, by the way, hard labor. Think about that in some cases. But this specific section was not extended to the colonies, nor to Palestine. The other piece of legislation was a local copyright ordinance, the one from 1924. This one dealt with the local aspects of copyright, such as customs and criminal law, and thank God in the local version they omitted the hard labor issue, so nobody was sentenced to hard labor over here. With this in mind, let's turn to Mr. Meir Kowalski. He was born in Ukraine, immigrated to Palestine in 1904 when he was 31 years old. He tried to be a chalutz, a pioneer, but that didn't quite work out for him. He realized that he'd better focus on teaching music. That was his thing. He did so in Jaffa and in Jerusalem. He founded Kinor Zion, the Violin of Zion, or something like that, a music band, and later was a conductor in a band in the Turkish, the Ottoman army. He then opened some shops of music instruments in Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, and Haifa. Some of the old guys might even remember vaguely or have a vague memory of such a shop here at Haifa. In other words, Mr. Kowalski was in the music business. At some point, he learned about this very strange thing called copyright, and he figured out, he was a kind of an entrepreneur, and he figured out that he would like to be the local agent for the British PRS, the Performing Rights Society here in Palestine. So he contacted them. He tried to persuade them, and they were a bit skeptical. So they sent someone from London to Palestine to meet Mr. Kowalski. The letters of the guy who met Mr. Kowalski was far more impressed with Mr. Kowalski's daughter than with Mr. Kowalski, but okay. And they were skeptical, and they said, okay, Mr. Kowalski, what have you done about copyright? And the answer was, well, not much. In fact, nothing at that point. So Mr. Kowalski wanted to prove that he is able and can do the job, that he can be the agent of the PRS, that is the British inspiration for Akum and the like, which we are familiar with today. And here's some more background. Silent movies, as were the movies at the 20s and early 30s, they were accompanied with live music, a band playing in the theater hall, accompanying the movie. In other words, in copyright terms, this was public performance. And unauthorized it was in most cases, if not all. Kowalski spotted the Zion Theater in Jerusalem, where a music band played adaptations, that's derivative work, of Beethoven, Mendelssohn, and Schumann. Kowalski then brought criminal charges against the Zion Theater. It was a private criminal case rather than a civil suit. The Attorney General at the time authorized and allowed Mr. Kowalski to do that. There were reasons for this choice, which is a bit strange, and the PRS frowned upon this choice, but there were reasons with Mr. Kowalski. First, in criminal cases, there's no need to prove ownership. Mr. Kowalski did not own, nor did he have a license to those works, and once you are a prosecutor, you don't have to bother with proving ownership, which he did not. Secondly, in a criminal case, one does not need to prove the damages, because the damages are quite unclear. There was no licensing practice in Palestine that you can say, oh, they lost, a few pounds or something like that. The Zion Theater was convicted, and in fact, this was the first copyright case in Palestine, a criminal copyright case on public performance of a band playing alongside a silent movie. It was fined, the theater was fined 1 Palestinian lira. Kowalski then rushed to the British guys and said, conviction! And indeed, he received the agency and served as the agent for the PRS from that year, from 1930 until 1949, when he sold his business to Akum, the Israeli Performing Rights Society. In other words, copyright law's Palestinian debut was in criminal law. It differs from civil options in some ways that I've mentioned, but Kowalski taught us something more. Criminal copyright is a market tool to gain more power. He used the criminal option to gain something else. I reread Eldar's book, and one question kept lingering and bothers Eldar and the readers, and Eldar manages to engage the readers in following this question. Why? Why do we have criminal copyright at all to begin with? Eldar documents the development of criminal copyright in the 19th century, the different phases it underwent following technological developments. Eldar shows the development of the legislation in the UK and the US and the informal political pressures such as, and Peter has discussed the international level, such as the US 301 special report. Israel is now, for a few years now, out of that review, which for those unfamiliar is quite a harsh review, unilateral review. Eldar finds that there's a gap between the legislation and enforcement, which he calls the criminal copyright gap. The historical analysis explains how, but still does not answer why. The why question. Why do we have criminal copyright? Eldar seeks for such explanations within copyright law and outside copyright law. He discusses the continuous expansion of copyright law, its proprietization, and its politics of public choice, namely how the content industries pressure the legislatures, whereas the public remains unorganized and, in fact, underrepresented or not represented at all in the legislative process. Eldar turns to theories of criminalization and to theories of copyright and asks whether they fit and provide an explanation. His conclusion is with some policy recommendations that we have seen and a heuristic for assessing the need for criminal copyright. Well, surprisingly, I agree with Eldar that criminal copyright is overemphasized, mostly unnecessary and hardly justified. So the question again is why? Why do we have criminal copyright at all? I think the core is that copyright as a whole is about power, not only about promoting arts and literature. This power may be financial power, political power in the sense of who has an anchor in the public discourse, and political power in the more brute, straightforward sense, on a local level and international level. Criminal law carries much force in promoting such power, and Eldar shows how this works. Criminalizing copyright infringements carries expressive power as well within the law, and it is addressed the use of criminal copyright to achieve other political goals is addressed to different audiences. The first audience is that of the end users, us. This is the power in the simplest way. Criminal risk is scary. Cease and desist letters sent by copyright owners or their lawyers often mention the potential sanctions. You know, you have been infringing my work and you may deserve the following. And they always cite the ceiling of statutory damages, never the bottom, the floor. And if it's relevant, they often, cease and desist letters often cite criminal offenses. And if you ever receive such a letter, even lawyers, it can be extremely scary and you will cease, quite likely, from what you're doing. A second audience for the act of criminalization of copyright is legislatures. If we convince legislatures that copyright should be protected with criminal law, then expanding the scope, prolonging the duration of the protection, adding additional civil causes, etc., that's easy. That becomes easy. Because if it's criminal, all the rest is becomes quite obvious. The third audience are the judges, courts. The message is similar. If the legislature used criminal offenses, the heaviest kind of legal tool possible, that is a serious matter. But the message here is even more political and legal. Eldar discusses at length the proprietization of copyright as a possible explanation for the criminalization of copyright specifically. Having reread the discussion, I think it is even more than that. And on second, you could have made the argument even stronger, I think. Protecting copyright with criminal sanctions does not only convey the message that copyright is property, it creates the message that copyright is property. It creates the very meaning of copyright as property. This is the goal, in my opinion, of criminal copyright, which I disagree with, but this is and I think Eldar leads to this conclusion. It is not only the tool, but when copyright infringement is so often compared to piracy and theft in the popular discussion and in legal discourse as well, a point Eldar discusses in the book, this treatment implies that copyright is property, but to be theftable, something that you can steal, we need to make it look more like property, and criminal copyright enables that exactly. If the message is conveyed to the above audiences, then the mission is accomplished. No need to actually use the criminal option. In other words, if criminalization is not a goal in itself but a means for achieving more power, we have yet another explanation for the criminal copyright that Elder has identified. Thus, I join Elder in his conclusion, quote, that quote, criminalization is a political process, unquote. Two more points here before I conclude. First, the recent amendment, which Niva has mentioned, to the Israeli Copyright Act, this took place after the publication of this book. The criminal amendments, amendment number 5, are relatively minor, okay? At least compared to the other elements in this amendment, which are the addition of blocking orders for allegedly infringing a website, unmasking anonymous users, and much more. Section 61 in the Copyright Act was amended to add commercial broadcasting and commercial making available activities to the list of criminal offenses. The official explanatory notes point to technological development. That's always, kind of a slogan. It always works, especially streaming, something which Eldar has explored in a separate paper of his. And the explanatory notes also comment that the offense is meant to capture commercial, systematic infringements. We are yet to see how this will play in courts. I suspect there will be very few cases, if any, because once again, the goal is not necessarily to put those guys, the infringers, in jail. It's to convey messages to other audiences. Eldar, you have a task, of course, here, and that is, write a short piece and analyze the amendment. You're already done. Okay. Yeah. There might be a genuine issue here that might necessitate criminal copyright in some cases. But with regular civil powers, the new blocking orders and unmasking options, what are the chances of actually using criminal copyright, the new option? I doubt, once again, if any. Last point. I mentioned Mr. Kowalski, so we have to go back to Mr. Kowalski. I mentioned Mr. Kowalski and his strategic use of criminal copyright to achieve the agency of the PRS here in Palestine. Strategic behavior is not new to copyright law. We have seen the London publishers sue the Scottish publishers at the late 18th century. We've seen Mr. Kowalski using copyright to get some position. We saw several rounds of mass lawsuits against users where the RIAA, the Recording Industry Association of America, has sued over 35,000 end users until it realized that that is not probably good PR for the industry. And today, here in Israel, we see some repeat players who use their power to sue end users. Two of these I would like to mention. One are photographers, something that Niva and Mayan, I saw earlier, have done some work on. And another one, something that I'm working on, is Charlton, an exclusive licensee of sports events, which repeatedly sues bars and cafes for placing a TV set and enabling people to come and join and watch together the World Cup, Olympics, etc. Over the last 4 years, they have submitted almost 400 lawsuits in Israel, and I suspect that for any lawsuit that they have submitted, there have been numerous cease and desist letters which were settled in one way, meaning someone paid, or another way, meaning I have no idea, because that's below the radar for us. Criminal law does not play a direct role, neither in the photographer's issues nor in the public performance Charlton issue. But the big picture is the same. The balance between the goal of promoting access to original works and the means to incentivize the creators. Through Eldar's discussion of criminal copyright, he beautifully teaches us about the dynamics of power in this game and its cost. Congratulations once again. It's been a true pleasure, and thank you for your attention.
I think you already did a great job in stimulating insights in law and society, in criminal law, in international IP law. And but here's your chance to address some of the questions that were raised, please.
Wow. So thank you so much for, first of all, for organizing this event. Thank you, Niva, for doing this. I really feel among friends and family, both my academic family and my real family from my real life. So I'll start with a few comments and then I'll tell two stories. The first story will be trying to tell the story of the book itself, what it tries to convey, and the second one would be the story behind this book, meaning that I'll talk a little bit about what led me to this topic and how I got to where I am today. So I will briefly first address a few of the comments which Professor Peter KU have successfully raised, and I agree with all of them, basically, saying that, first of all, subjectivity, I agree, it's very subjective. This is why I highly try to emphasize that during those regulation and policy making, I think we have to have a lot of different people around the table with different interests, which could look at this topic from different aspects. And that's the only way. If we only have the lobbyists for the content industry, we all know what they think about this type of legislation. It will be easily done. Efficiency. So efficiency is something which could be measurable in different types of ways. Basically, what I'm trying to suggest, this is, just to be fair, the suggestion of criminalization is not my own. I tried to take two very highly distinguishable scholars, Douglas Husak and Jonathan Schwartz, which actually provided this form of criminalization processes. One of them is efficiency. And this is actually Husak's points by saying that how can you actually measure it? So the point that Husak tries to make, and I try to convey it as well, is not whether to measure it by numbers, but rather to see whether it really works or not, and how does it really advances the goals that the state has said that it is substantially interesting and important to protect. So if, for instance, we take the Net Act, an act which was enacted 22 years ago, 1997, in the US, trying to criminalize the end users' use of downloading different types of musics and videos on a retail value of $1,000 or more. There was no single lawsuit in the US against end users for infringing copyright, not on the criminal scale. And if you are trying to take criminal law and you see that you don't even use that for that purposes, and that's part of the efficiency of criminal law, and it wasn't part of the result eventually, and I'll get to that a little bit later. Why is it national, not international? So that's an excellent point. I mean, one of the points that you didn't want to make is taking that to the international level. Why? Because criminal law highly differs between states. And this is why I'm suggesting an integrated approach, which you showed the different levels, and I'm suggesting that not every policymaker will agree with me, saying that you can disintegrate my theory and say that your country, for example, doesn't care about efficiency of criminal law because they want to criminalize behavior which is inherently wrong. That's fine, you can do that. On the international scale, it will be highly difficult, and what will happen eventually is that we'll have the strong countries like the US, in the example of criminal copyright, pushing all the other countries to actually embrace their perception of not copyright law, but criminal law. And that's problematic to my view. I think that, Michael, well, you agreed with me, but I think that power is the main theme of this book. And this is what I'm trying to convey through the historical analysis. I'm trying to understand why. Because copyright started as a civil rights, 1709 in Great Britain. The Statute of Anne, the first modern copyright act in the world. It was civil. So a lot of people tried to take it to property, to stealing, to theft, to piracy, but it was eventually something which was just a market response. It was a way to regulate the market, a new market which started to thrive. And it was about books, mainly, at that time. We wanted to stop people from now being able to copy books. really easily and substantially more cheap. And then only in 1862, it was again the United Kingdom who decided to criminalize some forms of copyright infringement. And what I try to trace is why. And the why goes to politics. Most of the time, what I witnessed behind this, when I went and explored it inside of copyright, outside of copyright, it's usually a lot about lobbyists and power. If you look at this, it's not just a trend in copyright, it's a trend all over the world for a lot of different types of things that are sometimes civil in nature. Taking criminal to that extent is not very wise, as I see it, for society. We should only criminalize those behaviors which should be criminalized. And how do we do that? We do it with a structured approach, like I suggest, and as I said, I'm not the first one who does it. The first one, I think, that has done it and applied it to copyright by using those different types of mechanisms to check, to examine whether or not criminalization is correct or not. So what I'm trying to tell here is the story. How a legal right that derived from a private commercial interest was slowly integrated into the penal system of various countries through various means. It is, as Michael said, it's a story on legislation, but it's a story about political power, technology, and society. By developing the framework of copyright criminalization via its origins and justification, I was able to explore this yet untold story of criminal copyright. And as Michael suggested, I have also written an article in Hebrew, which will be published here in Din Udvarim, Haifa Law Review, just hopefully very, very soon, about this new legislation. But I think the book was discussed here at length, and you can read it if you want. I wanted to go to a different story, and the story was how did I get here? And how I got to criminal copyright is actually pretty interesting. It's personal, but I'll tell you. So it all started here at 2004 when I started studying law and psychology. And at that time, I knew that I'm going to be a criminal lawyer. That's the only thing I wanted to do. I didn't think that there was something else other than criminal law when going to law school. One of that reasons is my father, who sits here, and he was a criminal attorney and a criminal judge later, and the vice president of this magistrate's court in Haifa. But then I started my second year. And in my second year at the law school, I went to a class called IP. And it was led by Professor Niva Koren. And after the first lesson, I knew that I'm not going to be a criminal lawyer. I'm going to be an IP lawyer. I loved it that much. And then a position opened up to be the Haifa Center for Law and Technology coordinator. I didn't even know what that means. I applied. I knew Michael Beranak a little bit because I worked with him a little bit in the faculty, and then Niva and Michael, who founded the center and co-directed that center, luckily took me as the coordinator. And then I understood that not only that I don't want to be an IP lawyer, I want to be an IP academic. At that time, I finished my studies. At that time, I actually met my wife at psychology, so that's why I studied psychology. But then I did my internship, etc. But I always knew that I'm going to pursue an academic career. I was enrolled to a different university to go and explore a little bit outside of this wonderful venue, and I went to Tel Aviv. And Michael was my advisor at both my thesis and my PhD. Now the thesis it's an interesting part of the story. I wrote about something which is called the three strikes policy, or the graduated response theory. Basically it means it was legislated in a few countries, meaning that if you got caught 3 times stealing, I'm saying stealing with quotes, copyright from the internet, you might be disconnected from the internet for a period up until a year. It started in the Far East, but it was mainly known for its French version. So I wrote an article about that, and then I went to a conference, and I met someone who is not only a superstar, he is the superstar in copyright, and especially international copyright, and that's Professor Peter Caillou, who has come here gracefully. and joined us. And he was the first one who wrote about this topic, and I was basically the third. And I met him in this conference knowing that, oh my God, I want to be in this parallel with this amazing scholar. I'm just beginning my PhD stage. And not only that, he's such a terrific scholar, he was such a terrific friend and commentator, and he sat with me, and we talked so much about this topic and other topics later when I came across him in other conferences. But when I finished my thesis on the three strikes policy, which was supposed to be part of my PhD, it was basically one of the topics which I was interested in, I went to do a PhD on a different topic. I told Michael that I'm done with this. It was great for a thesis. Now I want to do something else. And part of the reason was the thesis itself, because when I explored the three strikes policy, I came to realize that there are different types of criminal IP statutes, even if they're not conceived as criminal. And I'll tell you what I mean. It's not always going to jail. It's not always criminal fines by the criminal statutes. What happened in this law is basically that you committed an offense, some type of offense, through the internet, and now the state wants to take the internet from you because you committed the offense with it. So that happens in various types of criminal statutes. We usually look at it as a type of administrative law, not criminal law. But I sense that there's a criminal feeling to it, and I sense that I need to explore criminal law better. So I started reading about criminal IP, and yes, there was some research about that, but it wasn't enough. It mainly dealt with the US, and when it dealt with other things, it usually said, okay, the reason we have criminal copyright is because of technology. And it got me started to think that it's not just technology. Let's go to the history and see what happened. And from that, I learned a lot. So Michael advised me, okay, do that. Just write an article in English. That was my first article ever published in English. And on this three strikes policy, and I went to pursue a PhD on copyright criminalization. So I have to say here, Michael, thank you so much for being the best advisor anyone can have. Michael is truly an amazing mentor, was, still is today. And Michael guided me through it. Through all of it, and I suspect it wasn't that easy as Michael describes it, especially because, first of all, criminal law is not something which Michael usually deals with. He's a very, very amazing expert on IP, but criminal law it's not his main expertise, and I'm not sure I would have taken someone that does something which it's not my main field, but Michael told me, and he told me, go meet with criminal scholars all the time, and he helped me do that, to learn more about the criminal aspects. And this is what a perfect advisor does. So Michael, thank you so much for everything. And this book, as Niva said before, that everyone has a bite here. Niva and Michael has a lot of bites within it, and I'll get to Niva in a second. So Michael guided me through that, and not only that, I discovered so many things because of Michael's suggestions and comments and engagement within my project. And every time I told him that I want to pursue another direction, write another thing, and he always guided me through it and helped me, and he still does today. During that process, I fell in love with criminal copyright, and I fell in love with IP, intellectual property. And it was a great process during the PhD, but then I decided when I finished with it that it has to rest for a bit. So I could have published this book in 2014. It was easy enough just taking the PhD and sending it to a publisher and getting through with it. I didn't want to do that because I wanted to take some time off from the project. I felt that I was too much into it, that I have to go back and see it and come back to it when I'm ready enough to engage within it. So I started my postdoctoral studies here back at Haifa, and I had two great mentors, Professor Niva Kankoran and Professor Tal Zharsky. I worked with both of them on the other topics, not IP law. We started to do cyber law and information law. And soon enough, I got into a different field. Surprisingly enough, one of this field is now one of the expertise of my advisor, which is privacy law. But I came back to IP. I still love it deeply. And 2 years after doing that, going abroad and being at the Berkman Center, an amazing experience, less for my wife who has to stay home with a 9-month-old baby, and I flew back and forth for a year but it was, for me at least, it was worth it. Hopefully for you as well, though. But all that time I started to rework my book, and I discovered a whole world. So I wrote 2 more chapters, and I rewrote the chapters which would better fit what the perception that I had, not just on IP, but on scholarship and on academic writing in general. So it took time. It took about 1.5 years to rewrite it and do it the way that I wanted it to be published, and I was lucky enough to be chosen by one of the most prestigious academic publishing houses in the world, the oldest one, and to convey my message. So the message that I'm trying to convey here is that we have to always question criminalization processes. We have to question processes in general. But at this case, we have, as a society, we're risking a lot when we're criminalizing behavior which shouldn't be. And this is the message that I'm trying to convey in criminal copyright, but you can convey it in any other field. And this is something which I think is important to be done, not just in my field. So finally, a few thank you notes. So I'll start with Cambridge, obviously, as I said, but other than that, all my mentors, I have a lot of them, and I learned so much from so many people throughout the years. If it was from international scholars like Peter, which I met so many times, and he really aided me. And domestically, I have the most 2 wonderful academic parents anyone can ever ask. So thank you, Mom and Dad. And thank you for my uncles and aunts and brothers and sisters and whoever is in academia. If you don't know Haifa Law School, this is a family. This is actually a family. And we're very close, and we're very happy for each other's achievements because they are our own. And I learn every day from each and every one of you, so thank you. I thank my family. I thank my wife, Hadar, which knows that I was probably born to be in academic life. And she knows my rhythm and pace, and she always supports me. Always have, always, I'm sure will, throughout the years. And finally, my parents. My mother, which always is there for me, always has been. And my father, which this book is dedicated to. So my father, as I said, was an advocate. He was in the army. He was a colonel in the army, also dealing with legal issues. But then he was a criminal lawyer. He was, as I said, the vice president of the Magistrates Court here in Haifa, dealing with criminal law. And I think I took a lot of his path. And I'm a legal scholar, but my dad always said that academic life is like the Olympus. And I agree. And this is why I dedicated the book to him for everything that he has done for me. Thank you so much, everyone, and thank you all for coming here and sharing this thing with me. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing this intellectual journey. I think this reminds all of us how fortunate we are to be in academia and to enjoy this academic freedom that is full of surprises. So thanks everyone for joining us tonight, and enjoy the rest of the dessert. It's excellent chocolate.